June 23, 1942, Royal Air Force spotters at Pembrey airfield in South Wales watched through binoculars as a sleek German fighter descended through broken clouds. The aircraft lined up for landing with practiced precision. Alert sirens should have been screaming across the base. Anti-aircraft guns should have been tracking this enemy intruder. But something about the pilot's approach seemed completely wrong for an attack. The Focke-Wulf 90 touched down smoothly on the grass runway like it belonged there, rolled to a stop near the control tower casually. The engine shut down. The canopy slid back and Oberleutnant Armin Faber of WWII climbed out. He pulled off his leather helmet and looked around at the unfamiliar buildings with growing confusion. Then his blood turned absolutely cold in his veins. The aircraft on the flight line weren't Messerschmitts like they should be. They were Spitfires with Royal Air Force roundels. The uniforms running toward him weren't Luftwaffe grey. They were Royal Air Force blue. And the realization that hit Faber in that moment was devastating. The same realization was simultaneously striking British intelligence officers across southern England who were being frantically called. Germany's most lethal fighter had just been delivered intact to Britain, the aircraft that had been slaughtering Allied pilots for 8 months. The mysterious new weapon that seemed invincible in every encounter, handed over by a pilot who'd gotten disoriented and thought he was landing in occupied France. The intelligence windfall was beyond anything British intelligence could have dreamed of achieving. But what American test pilots would discover when they finally got their hands on this pristine aircraft would fundamentally change how every Allied fighter engaged German forces. For the rest of the war, tactics would be rewritten based on what they learned. For 8 brutal months, the Focke-Wulf 190 had been an absolute nightmare haunting Allied pilots across the Channel. It first appeared in combat over France in September 1941 without warning. From its very first engagement, experienced pilots knew instantly they were facing something extraordinary and dangerous. Royal Air Force Squadron Leader J.E. Johnny Johnson, who would become Britain's top-scoring ace, encountered the FW-190 in early 1942. He barely survived the encounter. It was faster than our Spitfire Mark VA was in level flight, and in the dive he wrote in his combat report. It could outroll us completely. Its firepower was absolutely devastating. For the first time in the war, our fighters were comprehensively outclassed by the enemy. The statistics backed up the terror pilots were experiencing. In the first 6 months of 1942, Royal Air Force fighter losses over France climbed dramatically. Experienced pilots who had survived the Battle of Britain were being shot down by an aircraft they couldn't match. The FW-190 could dive away from pursuing Spitfires with ease, outroll them in turning combat, destroy them with cannons firing 20mm explosive shells that tore aircraft apart. American pilots arriving in Britain with their P-47 Thunderbolts heard the warnings immediately from veterans. Don't engage the 190 in turning combat. Don't try to outroll it. Don't get into a dive competition. The list of what not to do was depressingly long. The list of what actually worked was terrifyingly short. Intelligence officers desperately needed answers to questions that kept pilots alive. What made this aircraft so devastatingly effective? What were its limitations and weaknesses? How could Allied fighters counter it and survive? But getting those answers required examining an actual FW-190 in detail. Every example shot down over Britain had been too damaged to reveal its engineering secrets properly. Then Armin Faber made his catastrophic navigation mistake. Oberleutnant Armin Faber was definitely not a novice pilot lacking experience. At 21 years old, he had already scored multiple victories in combat. He was considered a skilled member of WWII, the elite Richthofen fighter wing. On June 23, 1942, he was flying as part of a fighter sweep over the English Channel, providing top cover for German bombers attacking coastal targets in England. The mission had gone smoothly until the return flight back to France. Somewhere over the Channel, during aggressive manoeuvring while engaging British fighters, Faber became disoriented in the chaos. Cloud cover obscured the coastline completely. The sun's position gave him false directional cues. When he broke through the clouds and saw green countryside with an airfield below, his mind made a simple but catastrophic assumption. He thought he was over France looking at a Luftwaffe base preparing to land. He was actually over Wales looking at Royal Air Force Pembrey with enemy aircraft. The mistake seems completely impossible in hindsight when you look at maps. But combat disorientation was more common than militaries admitted publicly. Pilots flying at high speeds through clouds, pulling high-G maneuvers that affected blood flow to the brain, sometimes lost their sense of direction completely. Faber had done a 180-degree turn during the dogfight and simply didn't realize it. When he landed and saw the Spitfires with British markings, Faber frantically attempted to restart his engine, trying to take off again before being captured. But RAF personnel were already surrounding the aircraft with weapons drawn. Within minutes, he was in custody under guard. British intelligence officers were already examining the pristine Focke-Wulf 90A3 sitting on their runway. The immediate reaction at RAF headquarters in London bordered on euphoria when the news arrived. Air Chief Marshal Sholto Douglas, commanding RAF Fighter Command, immediately ordered the aircraft transported to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. Every single aspect of the machine was to be documented, measured, photographed and analysed by experts. Within 48 hours, the FW-190 was at Farnborough being inspected by Britain's top aviation engineers and test pilots. What they found explained absolutely everything Allied pilots had been experiencing in lethal combat. The aircraft was a genuine masterpiece of practical engineering philosophy. While the Spitfire represented elegant aerodynamic design and beauty, the FW-190 embodied brutal functionality and effectiveness. Its BMW 801 radial engine produced 1,700 horsepower compared to the Spitfire Mark V's 1,470 horsepower. But raw power wasn't the whole story of its dominance. The FW-190's most devastating advantage was its exceptional roll rate in combat. The aircraft could snap from one bank to the other faster than any Allied fighter could follow. This seemingly minor characteristic was actually revolutionary in air combat dynamics. When a Spitfire tried to follow an FW-190 through rolling maneuvers, the British fighter simply couldn't keep up with the Germans' agility. The German pilot could reverse direction, gain angles and line up killing shots before the Allied pilot could physically react. British test pilot Captain Eric Brown flew the captured FW-190 extensively and immediately understood why Allied pilots were dying. The ailerons were light and responsive at all speeds, he reported with concern. You could throw this aircraft around the sky with almost no effort required. The Spitfire required muscle and finesse to maneuver. The FW-190 responded instantly to thought. The firepower advantage was equally stunning when engineers examined the weapons. The FW-190A3 carried four 20mm MG-151 cannons and two 7.92mm machine guns. A 2-second burst delivered more explosive power than a Spitfire Mark V could generate in 10 seconds of continuous firing. The weapons were mounted in the wings close to the fuselage, creating a tight concentration pattern. That was absolutely devastating at typical combat ranges under 300 yards. The dive performance explained how FW-190s consistently escaped pursuing Spitfires in combat. The German fighter's heavier weight and cleaner aerodynamics meant it could outdive anything the RAF flew in 1942. Pilots who tried to follow an FW-190 into a steep dive watched helplessly as the German aircraft pulled away. But the systematic testing also revealed significant weaknesses, and this is where the intelligence value became strategic gold for Allied forces planning operations. The FW-190's radial engine, while powerful at low altitude, created serious cooling problems at high altitudes. Above 20,000 feet, the aircraft's performance fell off dramatically and noticeably. The engine struggled in the thin air, and pilots reported loss of power and overheating issues. Meanwhile, the Spitfire's Merlin engine, specifically designed for high-altitude operation, actually performed better as altitude increased. The heavy weight that made the FW-190 a superior dive bomber also made it less maneuverable in sustained turning combat. The aircraft could outroll a Spitfire instantly, but it couldn't outturn one in a prolonged horizontal engagement. If an Allied pilot could force an FW-190 into a sustained horizontal turn fight, the advantage shifted dramatically to the British fighter. Most critically for tactics, American engineers discovered that the FW-190's controls became extremely heavy at high speeds. In a dive exceeding 400 miles per hour, the pilot needed significant physical strength to pull out safely. This created a vulnerable moment that could be exploited. If an Allied fighter could pursue an FW-190 through the initial dive and catch it during the pull-out maneuver, when the German pilot was fighting his own controls with both hands, attacks became feasible and often successful. British intelligence immediately began distributing tactical bulletins to RAF squadrons across England, but they also did something that would prove absolutely crucial for the air war's eventual outcome. They invited American test pilots to Farnborough to fly the captured FW-190 and learn firsthand. In August 1942, US Army Air Force pilots arrived at Farnborough to examine Germany's secret weapon up close. These pilots would return to American training bases with knowledge that would save hundreds of American lives. Major Cass Huff, one of the first American pilots to fly the captured FW-190, filed a detailed report. That report was distributed to every fighter group preparing to deploy to Europe for combat. His assessment was brutally blunt and tactical. The FW-190 will beat any Allied fighter below 20,000 feet if the German pilot knows what he's doing, Huff wrote. Our advantage is altitude exclusively. Above 25,000 feet, our P-47s and later modelled Spitfires have the edge. Force them high and we win. Let them dictate low-altitude combat and we die. This single piece of intelligence fundamentally changed American fighter tactics in the European theatre. When P-47 Thunderbolt units began operations in 1943, their doctrine emphasized high-altitude combat exclusively. Bomber escorts flew at maximum altitude possible. Fighter sweeps operated above 25,000 feet whenever mission allowed. When German fighters attempted to engage American formations, pilots would climb aggressively, forcing the FW-190 to follow into thin air, where their engines struggled and lost power. The captured FW-190 also directly influenced American aircraft development programs. Engineers at Wright Field studied the roll rate advantage extensively and began modifying P-47 and P-51 ailerons to improve responsiveness. The FW-190's gun placement informed American thinking about optimal weapons concentration in fighters. Even the cockpit layout, which German designers had optimized for combat efficiency, influenced American fighter design going forward. But perhaps the most important lesson came from understanding that the FW-190 wasn't invincible like propaganda claimed. It was an excellent aircraft with specific advantages and equally specific exploitable weaknesses. Allied pilots who had been psychologically intimidated by the 190's fearsome reputation now had concrete information. They knew how to fight it and win consistently. By late 1943, the tactical situation had shifted dramatically in Allied favor. American P-47s and P-51 Mustangs were engaging FW-190s at high altitude, where Allied fighters held the advantage. RAF Spitfire Mark 9s with upgraded Merlin engines could match the FW-190's performance across most altitude ranges. Pilots on both sides understood they were flying different aircraft optimized for completely different conditions. The kill ratios began shifting steadily in Allied favor as knowledge spread. FW-190 losses climbed as American and British pilots systematically exploited the intelligence gained from Faber's captured aircraft. German pilots noticed that Allied fighters were no longer making the tactical mistakes that had given the FW-190 its early dominance. Oberleutnant Josef Pips Priller, a high-scoring FW-190 ace, commented in late 1943 that American pilots had clearly studied the aircraft thoroughly. They know not to follow us into rolling scissors anymore. They force us high where our engines labour and struggle. They've learned, he wrote grimly in his combat journal, The captured FW-190 remained at Farnborough throughout the entire war, serving as a reference aircraft for evaluating new German variants as they appeared in combat. When the FW-19D9 Dora with its inline engine appeared in late 1944, Allied intelligence immediately compared it to Faber's captured aircraft. Understanding how German designers had addressed the original model's high-altitude limitations. After the war ended, aviation historians calculated the impact of Faber's mistake on the war's outcome. The intelligence gained from examining the intact FW-190 was shared with thousands of Allied pilots worldwide through tactical bulletins, training films, and direct demonstration flights using the captured aircraft. The knowledge influenced aircraft development, tactical doctrine, and operational planning across multiple air forces. Captain Eric Brown, who flew more captured enemy aircraft than any other Allied pilot, would later write something profound. Faber's navigation error gave us the Rosetta Stone for understanding German fighter design completely. Every tactical advantage the FW-190 possessed was documented in detail, and every weakness was systematically exploited in combat. That single aircraft probably saved more Allied lives than any intelligence coup of the entire war. The irony was not lost on German intelligence when they eventually learned what had happened. One Luftwaffe officer commented bitterly, "We spent months trying to capture a Spitfire Mark 9 intact so we could study its improvements and counter them. The British didn't have to try anything. We delivered our best fighter directly to them, gift-wrapped." Armin Faber spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner of war camp in Canada. He survived the war and returned to Germany, where he lived until 1976 in relative obscurity. Luftwaffe records suggest he was initially blamed severely for the loss of the aircraft, but later assessments acknowledged that combat disorientation could happen to any pilot under stress. The real question was why German intelligence had arrogantly assumed the British would never get their hands on an intact FW-190 through any means. The story of Faber's captured fighter teaches a crucial lesson about technological advantage in modern warfare. Germany's Focke-Wulf Vulnerability represented a quantum leap in fighter design when it appeared in 1941. For nearly a year, it dominated Allied aircraft through superior performance and innovative engineering. But that advantage evaporated completely the moment Allied engineers could examine the actual machine in detail. No aircraft is truly invincible, regardless of propaganda. Every design involves compromises and trade-offs that can be exploited. The FW-190's low-altitude dominance came at the cost of high-altitude performance. Its excellent roll rate came with heavy high-speed controls. Its powerful armament added weight that reduced overall maneuverability. Once Allied pilots understood these fundamental trade-offs, they could systematically exploit them in combat. Today, the FW-190 is remembered as one of World War II's great fighter designs rightfully. Aviation museums display surviving examples as masterpieces of German engineering and innovation. But the aircraft's reputation is inseparable from the intelligence coup that revealed all its secrets. In the complex calculus of wartime advantage, one pilot's momentary disorientation over the English Channel turned Germany's secret weapon into an open book. The FW-190 that Armin Faber accidentally delivered to Britain became the aircraft that taught the Allies exactly how to win. The lesson echoes through military history to this day. Superior technology matters in warfare. Superior intelligence matters significantly more. And sometimes the greatest victories come not from devastating attacks, but from simple mistakes that give your enemy exactly what they've been desperately seeking. The Focke-Wulf 190 could have remained a mystery, an invincible opponent slaughtering Allied pilots through psychological advantage as much as technical superiority. Instead, it became a teaching tool that every Allied pilot studied, learned from, and ultimately defeated in combat. One navigation error over Wales, one landed aircraft intact, one intelligence windfall that changed the air war over Europe forever. That's how the Allies got Germany's secret fighter and learned all its secrets. And that's how a single mistake shifted the balance of power in the skies.